So my name is Jonathan Freeman. I wear a couple different hats. I'm only wearing one right now. But I work with Shasta County Public Health as a community organizer, and I'm also a director of the Native Roots Network, a local organization that is helping promote the vitality of the Native community. And so for me, this opportunity is about how our community can come together to build our own empowerment, our own ability to define our futures. Simba, Simbi. Hold up that which holds you up. It's a Congolese phrase. I learned about it from hold on a second here. Okay. I learned about it from a powerful sister whose name is Free. She's a director of the Untold RVA, a history action group from Richmond, Virginia. Simba, Simbi. Say it with me if you'd like. Simba, Simbi. To me, Juneteenth is not only about marking the day from which we become free-ish, but it's also a day for us to reflect on our ancestors and their strength, their love, their perseverance, and our collective quest for resilience. You can feel them all around us. They're here. My family has a moment in Texas. There are missing dates and missing pieces to the story, but I know my grandmother's grandparents were married in Bonham, Texas, 1878. This is the Black and Choctaw branch of my family tree. 13 years before that wedding, we had the General Granger delivering that order that we are here to celebrate today. And in honoring my ancestors and your ancestors, I want to take a few steps back and give a little historical context on how we got to that point. You know, this helps me remember why we honor our ancestors. They endured so much. And yet, through all that, they continued, and in many ways resilient. We are here because of them. And so we hold up that which holds us up. Simba, Simbi. Our wonderful sister who welcomed us here on Wintu land has a story, and the Wintu story has a similar collision point that is shared with the descendants of enslaved Africans. In our connection, we can support each other's healing and support our futures. How did this slavery thing come about? Before we go there, let's remember that long before Europeans entered the picture, Africa had its own history. Diverse kingdoms and cultures going way back. So after the Crusades and the development of seaworthy ships to transport European armies across the Mediterranean Sea, these Europeans began sailing out into the Atlantic, looking for new ways to make money, new commerce. Pope Nicholas issues the papal bull Dum Divassus, until different in 1452, permitting the Portugal king to invade the newly discovered west coast of Africa. King Alfonso requests this to confirm his trade rights. We grant you, the kings Portugal and Spain, by these present documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, property, it goes on for a while, and reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Sounds a little bit like slavery. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI directs his holy hell on the newly invaded Western Hemisphere. These are known as the Doctrines of Discovery. This is not some kind of conspiracy theory, some kind of fictional Da Vinci Code thing. This is actually the historical legal framework that establishes the horror that was to follow. It is still enshrined in our law, the United States law. As recently as the 1990s, there's a Supreme Court case that deals with the Oneidas in New York and their efforts to deal with some kind of property tax issue. And this was actually cited at the Supreme Court level. So we begin to see the connection of these stories. In 1518, King Charles authorizes Spain to ship enslaved Africans directly to the Americas, no longer having to go through European ports first. Early on, it's a very, very small numbers, 1 or 2 per ship. Then it's 30 or 40 per ship. By the mid-1520s, it's up to 200 to 300 enslaved people per ship. These people were taken to the Caribbean and South and Central America primarily. The first of the slaves from Africa to reach North America came with the Spanish conquistadors. Esteban came with Narvaez in 1528. And Juan Garrido came with Ponce de Leon, not as a slave, but as a freedman and a conquistador. You see, at this point, racism was not an integral part of Spanish slavery. 1619 is usually the date given for the formal beginning of institutionalized slavery in what would become the United States. But many argue, including historians from the Smithsonian, that there were many other enslaved Africans that were used by the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and their attempt to invade, steal, and seize land and resources along the southeast coast. They had likely been with Sir Francis Drake at Roanoke in 1586. They had already rebelled and destroyed a Spanish settlement in South Carolina. But we can use 1619 as a starting point, but we must not erase or forget the estimated 500,000 who were brought across the Atlantic before that date. That might be one of my ancestors, and that might be one of your ancestors. And so we hold them up. Simba, Simbi, lest they be forgotten. The Middle Passage. Between 1500 and 1866, 12.5 million of our grandmothers and grandfathers were transported. 1.8 million never made it and died along the way, to be lost in history. Henry Louis Gates estimates that maybe a little less than 400,000 were brought directly to the U.S. Our family members made it somehow, only to be unloaded and sold into chattel slavery. If we use 1619 as a point on the timeline, then 100 years later we come to 1719. And then 57 more years, we come to 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. And this time, it has become a racial thing. Racism is institutionalized within slavery and enjoys the service of the law and the sanction of religion. During the Revolutionary War, the British would free any slave that escaped into their lines, not as an act of morality, but as a military tactic to interrupt the colonists' economic systems dependent on slave labor. Their longer presence in the North causes a greater impact. 1789 marks the commencement of the Constitution of the United States. We, the people, does not include enslaved Africans. Jefferson, Franklin, Hancock, and others, you got to remember, they owned slaves. An interesting note is that slavery is abolished in many of the northern states in those early years after the Revolution. The two holdouts being New York and New Jersey. New York 1799 and New Jersey 1804. But it did not mean you had to free your slaves. It just meant you could not buy any new ones. But the South is a different story. It is maybe the more familiar story. We skip lightly over the Middle Passage, but to know our people's resilience, we need to realize the absolute horror of the process. Captured in Africa, often according to Gates, by other Africans, forced to coastal slave ports, sold, sorted, and shipped, super crowded, super violent, and super vile conditions awaited the humans, treated as livestock cargo as they were hauled across the Atlantic. They say sharks had become so familiar with the slave ships that they literally followed them, awaiting the dead, the sick, or those who committed suicide by jumping overboard. 1808 marks the official ban on international slave trade. It was morally okay to own slaves and treat them poorly, but it was no longer morally okay to remove them from their country of origins. Kind of funny. And besides, at that point, the population of slaves reproduced itself nicely, and the offspring could be bought and sold. In the South, slaves were big business. In fact, they had become the South's largest financial asset, worth more than $3.5 billion. So by the time the Civil War breaks out, the Southerners are not just fighting for free labor or the struggle between state and federal rights. They were fighting to protect their financial assets. But before we jump into the Civil War, let's talk Texas. Oh, Texas. We could probably do a couple days on the dark depths of Texas. We'll start with the Mexican War of Independence. This comes to a close in 1821. Mid-1820, Sam Austin, in agreement with Mexico, establishes an Anglo colony of 300 in Texas. They're there to help colonize a region that had met strong native resistance against European ideas to take and sell the land. 300 years the native people resisted there. The trouble is, Mexico is also at the same time working to ban slavery, and Sam and the others want slaves. 1836, Spain recognizes Mexicans' independence. So by the time the Civil War breaks out, and the Southerners are not, oops, wrong line. 1836, and the Anglo-Texan they rebel. 30,000 Anglos are in the territory, with about 300 slaves at the time of the Texas Revolution. This is 1836. When we remember the Alamo, we also remember a fight to keep slaves. After 1836, thousands of Anglo settlers pour into the independent nation of the Republic of Texas. There's a big hang-up with Texas joining the U.S. as a state at this point because the debate over slavery is heating up, and they don't want to admit another slave state to the Union and upset the precarious balance. By 1845, there are 30,000 slaves in Texas, and Texas is admitted into the Union. 1846 to 1848, the Mexican-American War, and Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California, right here, are signed away in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Another side note, no one consulted the natives. After, oh no, we're getting double notes here, sorry. 1850, 58,161 people held in slavery in Texas. 1860, 182,566 people held in slavery in Texas. 1861, Texas and 6 other states secede from the Union upon the election of Lincoln. 4 more states joined them. Lincoln tries to keep the Union together, even if it means continuing slavery. But distrust prevails, and Confederate forces attack Fort Sumter, and the Civil War begins. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. And this is something that was really interesting to me. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. Again, this is a military tactic. Lincoln freed the slaves in the rebel-owned territories. He did not free the slaves in the Union territories or states that even were bordering the southern states. At the same time as the Emancipation Proclamation is being drafted, Lincoln also signs the death sentence for 38 Dakota, which would be the largest mass execution in U.S. history. As the Civil War rages on, some slave owners moved to Texas in hoping to keep their slaves. 1865 in April, General Lee surrenders. The Civil War is technically over. By then, 180,000 free black men serve in the Union Army. Over 40,000 are killed, they die, whether it's by combat, disease, or infection. Meanwhile, Texas says, nah, nope. It takes another 2 months for the Union General Gordon Granger to arrive in Galveston, Texas and deliver the General Orders number 3, the snippet of it which is in your program. And this tells the Texans that they no longer could own slaves. And through all of that, our ancestors survived. Simba Simbi. We celebrate that day and that order, but in reading that order thoroughly, we start to see the roadmap for what was to come. We have Reconstruction, Jim Crow. 100 years later is when we start to actually have the Civil Rights Movement. The struggle continues and we have work to do. Before he is killed, Dr. King is quoted as saying, "I fear that I have integrated my people into a burning house." It may not be enough for us just to have an equal part in a system that continues to harm, exploit, and extract. As we celebrate the fortitude of our people and our path forward toward liberation, the work continues. We must continue to collectively work to end human trafficking, sex trafficking, the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women, child detention at borders, the raising of dams and the flooding of sacred lands, the skyrocketing cost of housing and health care, the mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, the return and rise of homophobia, xenophobia, and racism. As writer Ijoma Ulu says, you cannot only pick up the parts of the revolution that free you and then fight against those working to free themselves and call yourself a revolutionary. I'm going to pause for the freedom train.
Yeah,
Jonathon. We must continue to strive to reach our highest potential and the greatest expression of our liberation. We owe it to our ancestors. We owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the future. We owe it to those who have held us up and to those who hold us up. Simba Simbi.